The Dark Scrolls. The end of Henry VIII did not arrive like the sudden fall of a sword. It came instead like a creeping shadow, lengthening slowly, almost imperceptibly, until all light was consumed. His decline stretched across years, a cruel parody of the power he had once wielded, as though fate itself wished to prolong his agony. To understand the horror of his death, one must first look upon the man he had become in those final years, when majesty rotted into misery, and a king transformed into a prisoner of his own corrupted flesh. Once, Henry was the golden prince of Europe. Chroniclers spoke of his strength, his beauty, his intellect. He was tall, broad, and athletic, a man who excelled in jousts, who hunted with relentless vigor, who danced with such grace that women whispered of his charm. His reign began with promise, with music, poetry, and diplomacy. But time is a hunter no crown can escape, and Henry's body, burdened by indulgence, injury, and rage, began to betray him. By the 1540s, the king who had dazzled Europe was unrecognizable, both in form and in spirit. His weight had swollen monstrously, pushing him to over 400 pounds. Servants whispered that when he moved, the timbers of his palace groaned beneath him. He could not walk unaided. Instead, strange devices, mechanical hoists and padded chairs, were built to carry him from chamber to chamber. The mighty hunter who had once galloped through the English forests was now lifted like cargo, reduced to immobility by the very bulk of his body. Those who beheld him saw not majesty but grotesque deformity, a man who looked less like a sovereign and more like a beast fed beyond reason. But it was not his size alone that horrified those around him. It was the stench. From his legs oozed ulcers, deep and unhealed wounds that bled corruption. These sores were the legacy of a great jousting accident years earlier, when a horse had fallen upon him, crushing his body and tearing open his flesh. The injury never healed. 1. Infection rooted itself deep within him, refusing to release its grip. Each day the wounds wept pus and blood. Each day physicians cut, drained, and bound them, but nothing availed. The sores grew deeper, darker, and fouler, until they exhaled a smell so vile that courtiers flinched when summoned near. The odor clung to him like a second skin. It seeped through his chambers, poisoning the air of Whitehall and Hampton Court alike. Visitors gagged behind perfumed handkerchiefs. Servants grew pale from the labor of dressing his wounds. To touch him was to risk sickness. To stand too near was to breathe corruption. For some, the king's presence became indistinguishable from death itself, as though his body were already decaying while he yet lived. Still, Henry devoured life as if in denial of death. His appetite remained insatiable. Platters of roasted meat, dripping with fat, were carried to his chambers daily. Pies stuffed with game, jellies sweetened with imported sugar, and goblets overflowing with red wine crowded his tables. He consumed like a man desperate to fill a void that could never be satisfied. Yet, every bite deepened his ruin. Gout inflamed his joints, diabetes ravaged his blood, and his heart labored beneath the crushing weight of his body. Physicians muttered of imbalance, of humors gone awry, but they were powerless. The king's table was his throne, his altar, and his gallows. The once handsome monarch was now a spectacle of decay. His skin sagged in folds, pocked by sores. His eyes, once bright and lively, grew ringed with darkness. clouded with pain and suspicion. His breath rattled, thick with phlegm. His voice, once quick with laughter and song, had turned coarse, erupting in sudden rages that terrified all who served him. No longer did courtiers admire his presence. Now they endured it. They bowed not from devotion, but from fear. For though the king's body failed, his power remained absolute. And Henry wielded that power with merciless paranoia. In his final years, he lashed out at those closest to him. Long-trusted advisors found themselves accused of treachery, dragged to the Tower, and executed. Even noble families who had served him faithfully for decades trembled at his suspicion. He saw betrayal in every glance, conspiracy in every word. His wives had fared no better. Catherine of Aragon discarded, Anne Boleyn beheaded, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth, Anne of Cleves annulled, Catherine Howard executed, Catherine Parr clinging desperately to survival. Women had been pawns in his hunger for power and heirs. But now, even they became ghosts haunting his decline. At night, the king lay restless in his chamber, sheets damp with sweat and blood. Priests whispered prayers at his bedside. Physicians concocted tonics, laced with herbs and wine, but nothing brought relief. The pain was constant, gnawing at him with animal ferocity. Servants crept quietly to remove bandages, heavy with pus, only to replace them with fresh clot that would soon be fouled again. The rhythm of his nights was a grotesque liturgy of suffering. Groans, the hiss of knives lancing sores, the stifled gag of attendants, the muttered prayers for mercy. Yet beneath the agony lurked a deeper torment: fear. Henry VIII had defied popes, toppled monasteries, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. He had made himself a god-king, answerable to no mortal power. But in the silence of his chamber, as pain clawed at his flesh, he could not escape the question of what awaited him beyond death. Did he dream of Anne Boleyn, her eyes wide as the axe fell? Did he hear the screams of those burned for heresy? Did he see the accusing gaze of Catherine of Aragon, cast aside after years of loyalty? His court could shield him from rebellion, but not from conscience. The courtiers, for their part, lived in terror of him. To serve Henry in those years was to endure a waking nightmare. The smell of corruption haunted them. The threat of execution loomed over them, and the spectacle of their king's ruin eroded all illusion of majesty. They bowed. They smiled. They spoke words of loyalty, but in their hearts they recoiled. The mighty Tudor court had become a theater of fear, its stage dominated by a bloated, festering figure who clung to life with a tyrant's desperation. Outside the palace walls, whispers spread. The people of England heard rumors of the king's decline. Some said it was God's punishment for his cruelty, a judgment upon the man who had defied the Pope and shed rivers of blood. Others whispered of curses, of sorcery, of divine retribution. Few pitied him. Many awaited his death with bated breath, knowing it would mark the end of an age and the uncertain rise of another. But death did not come swiftly. It stalked him slowly, savoring the hunt. Each day was a new humiliation. Each night was a descent into deeper suffering. The king who had once been the very image of strength and glory now sat upon a throne of agony, his majesty eaten away by rot. And yet, he remained Henry. He ordered executions. He schemed marriages. He demanded feasts. He roared with rage at servants who faltered in their duty. He believed, against all evidence, that he still held dominion over the world. But the truth was plain for all to see. Henry VIII was no longer master of England. He was a prisoner of his own dying body, shackled by disease, haunted by the ghosts of his past, and pursued by a death he could no longer deny. Thus began the last act of his reign, a slow descent, not into the glories of legend, but into the horrors of corruption. A king who had broken nations, humbled the church, and bent history itself to his will, now found himself powerless against the most ancient foe of all, time. His court watched in silence, his enemies waited with anticipation, and his people whispered in dread. For all knew the same truth. The sun was setting on Henry VIII, and when it finally sank, it would plunge England into darkness. The shadow that had begun to creep across Henry's reign grew heavier with every passing month. Where once his presence had inspired awe, now it inspired dread. The king himself had become a spectacle of torment, his body a battlefield where disease and decay fought with his stubborn will to live. What remained of his majesty was hidden beneath layers of silks and jewels, but no fabric could conceal the truth. The body of Henry VIII was rotting while he still breathed. Servants who attended him spoke of the rituals required to keep the king merely presentable. Each morning, long before the sun rose over the Thames, they gathered in silence, their faces pale with dread of the tasks ahead. Physicians in dark robes unwrapped the bandages that covered his swollen legs. What lay beneath was not flesh as men knew it, but something monstrous. Great ulcers split the skin, their edges dark with corruption, their centers oozing with pus and blood. The stench struck like a blow. Some servants fainted, others gagged, struggling to hold their composure in the presence of majesty. The bravest among them worked quickly, dabbing at the sores with cloth soaked in vinegar or wine, praying that the sharpness of the liquid would drive away infection. But the sores always returned, deeper, more foul. No remedy availed. They tried ointments of herbs, salves of honey, even powders of ground metals thought to cleanse the blood. They cauterized the wounds with hot irons, the hiss of searing flesh echoing in the chamber like the sound of damnation. The king roared in agony, his voice shaking the tapestries. Yet still the ulcers spread. It was as though his very blood carried poison, and no hand could purge it. The pain never left him. Each movement was agony. To shift upon his bed was to feel knives twist within his legs. To stand was impossible. To sit for long was torment. The once tireless hunter was now a captive of immobility, chained not by iron but by flesh itself. And yet, even in his state, he demanded ceremony. His chamber was still a court. Musicians played softly. Courtiers bowed. Priests intoned prayers. All the rituals of kingship continued, though all who gathered knew that beneath the silks, beneath the crown, the king was already decomposing. The ulcers were not the only torment. His body, swollen and distended, pressed upon his heart and lungs. Each breath came heavy, like a bellows groaning under strain. His chest rattled with phlegm. Some nights he gasped as though drowning in air. Physicians brought concoctions, draughts of opium, potions of herbs, but none brought relief. The king's breathing filled the palace at night, a sound like the growl of some great beast in its death throes. And still, he ate. His appetite remained insatiable, perhaps driven by desperation, perhaps by habit, perhaps by the dark truth that indulgence was the only pleasure left to him. Great tables were laid in his chambers, laden with roasted beef, lamb, swan, and venison. Gared pastries glistened beside goblets of red wine. Servants carved and poured, carrying food to his lips as though feeding a child. He devoured with gusto, grease running down his chin, wine staining his beard. The food weighed upon his stomach, thickening his blood, worsening his gout, but he would not be denied. He ate as if he could consume life itself and stave off death by sheer force of appetite. But food turned quickly to poison. His bowels grew sluggish, his body unable to purge the waste of such excess. Physicians whispered of blocked humors, of the king's very insides rotting. His skin broke into sores, his breath grew fouler still. Even his urine, when it came, was thick and tainted, dark with the evidence of a body unraveling. Servants dreaded the task of cleaning him. The king who once stood as the model of vigor now needed to be tended like an infant. They washed him, lifted him, wiped him. They bore the weight of his body with straining arms, sweat pouring down their faces as they maneuvered the great bulk. To touch him was to court nausea, but to refuse was unthinkable. Those who served Henry in those years endured their own form of torture, condemned to witness the daily spectacle of his decay. And still, above all, there was the smell. It was not the simple odor of sweat or age, but something deeper, something unnatural. It was the smell of rot, of corruption. It clung to walls and curtains, seeped into garments, and followed courtiers as they left his presence. Some said it was the scent of damnation itself, that the king's sins had begun to burn through his flesh before he was even dead. Yet Henry would not acknowledge defeat. He roared at his physicians, demanding remedies. He cursed the Pope, the devil, fate itself, blaming all but himself for his suffering. He signed decrees with trembling hands, his signature blotched and uneven, but still carrying the force of law. He spoke of future wars, of alliances, of heirs, as though time stretched before him endlessly. But in truth, his days were measured not in years, but in agonies. The court lived in a state of suspended dread. No one dared speak of his death, yet all knew it approached. Each time his breathing faltered, each time his sores bled more profusely, whispers spread through the palace that the king had finally succumbed. Yet he always lingered, clinging to life with the stubbornness that had defined his reign. He seemed determined to outlast death itself, to force his broken body to obey by sheer force of will. But the body does not yield forever. The ulcers deepened. Infection spread through his blood. His heart strained. His lungs labored. His very flesh became his tormentor, turning upon him with relentless cruelty. He was not simply dying. He was being undone, unmade, his body collapsing inward day by day. Outside, England waited. The people murmured of prophecy, of divine justice. Some rejoiced, believing his death would free them from tyranny. Others feared the chaos that would follow, for Henry's children were young, his succession uncertain, his kingdom fragile. But none could look away, for even in ruin, Henry VIII remained the center of England's fate. His life and his death would shape the destiny of a nation. And so, as the winter of 1546 deepened into the dawn of 1547, the spectacle of the king's suffering became unbearable. Servants whispered that the palace itself seemed cursed, that the air was thick with dread. Priests lingered longer at his bedside. Courtiers kept their distance, bowing quickly before retreating to fresher air. The king's chamber became both throne room and tomb, a place where majesty and mortality collided in grotesque union. This was the torture untold, the slow destruction of a man who had once seemed indestructible. Henry VIII, the Lion of England, was being devoured by his own flesh. No enemy had struck him down. No assassin's blade had found him. It was his own body, corrupted and decayed, that exacted the final vengeance. And as he lay upon silken sheets, surrounded by the trappings of royalty, his groans echoed through the corridors like the tolling of a funeral bell. The king was not yet dead, but in truth, death had already claimed him. Piece by piece, ulcer by ulcer, breath by ragged breath. What remained was a hollow spectacle. A man trapped within a rotting cage of flesh, clinging to power even as the grave opened beneath him. And all England waited for the moment when the last shadow would fall. The body of Henry VIII was already lost to rot and disease, but the cruelest tortures were not inflicted upon his flesh alone. They came instead upon his mind, a mind once sharp, ambitious, and commanding, now twisted into a labyrinth of fear and suspicion. The man who had ruled England with a will of iron found himself besieged not by foreign armies, but by ghosts of his own making. Nights in Whitehall grew long and restless. The chamber where Henry lay, heavy with the reek of infection and the oppressive silence of attendants, became a theater of shadows. Candlelight flickered against the gilded walls, casting grotesque shapes that seemed to leer and mock him. In those trembling flames, Henry saw more than decoration. He saw faces. He saw accusations. He saw the unrelenting judgment of the dead. Anne Boleyn was there, her dark eyes wide, her lips parted as though to speak the words she never had time to utter before the axe fell. Catherine of Aragon lingered too, her dignity unbroken, and her gaze cold, as if demanding to know why loyalty had been repaid with humiliation. The fair and gentle Jane Seymour appeared like a phantom, pale and bloodied from the childbirth that had ended her life. Even Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, seemed to flit at the edges of his vision, her scream echoing from the scaffold where she begged for mercy. These were not dreams, for he saw them with eyes open. They came to him in the half-light, in the moments when pain stripped away his defenses, when his swollen body trapped him in immobility and silence. To his attendants, he muttered at shadows, cursed at unseen enemies, raised trembling hands as though to ward off specters only he could see. Some whispered that the king was haunted, that the blood he had spilled had returned to claim him. Priests tried to soothe him with prayers, yet their Latin chants seemed only to deepen his unrest, for they reminded him of the Rome he had defied and the faith he had shattered. He was Sud, a supreme head of the Church of England. Yet in those moments he seemed a man abandoned by heaven, left to wrestle with demons of his own sins. Paranoia poisoned what remained of his reign. He trusted no one fully, not even those who had served him faithfully for decades. Old companions were dismissed with cold suspicion. Counselors found themselves interrogated, their every word weighed like treachery. Henry signed death warrants with the same trembling hand that could scarcely hold a quill, sending men he had once embraced as brothers to the axe. He believed himself surrounded by plots, yet the greatest plot of all was within him, a conspiracy woven of fear, guilt, and madness. He raged at his last wife, Catherine Parr, accusing her of heresy when her theological debates challenged his fragile pride. For a moment, her life hung in the balance, until Henry, perhaps swayed by pity, or perhaps by the fleeting clarity of his conscience, relented. But the reprieve was temporary. His suspicion never left her. She lived in constant terror, walking the narrow line between devotion and self-preservation, never knowing when her husband's paranoia might drag her to the scaffold, as it had so many before. Servants walked on trembling feet around him. A careless glance could be mistaken for insolence. A delayed bow might be branded disloyalty. The court became a place of whispers, each word chosen carefully, each gesture calculated to avoid the king's wrath. And still, it was never enough. He saw betrayal in every corner. He smelled treachery as keenly as the rot that filled his chamber. His very crown seemed to press upon him like a burden too heavy to bear, its weight no longer a symbol of glory, but of torment. But the greatest torture lay in his isolation. Though surrounded by attendants, Henry was alone. No one dared speak truth to him. No one dared show pity. His children were distant, pawns in the games of succession. Courtiers bowed, smiled, and withdrew, leaving him to the silence of his chamber. He who had once commanded crowds, who had thrived on the adoration of subjects and the fear of enemies alike, now languished in solitude. And in that solitude, the voices of the dead grew louder. There were moments when rage gave way to despair. He would weep, his massive frame shaking, his sores bleeding afresh from the convulsions. He would call out for God, begging for deliverance, then curse the heavens when no answer came. His soul swung violently between defiance and terror, like a ship caught in a storm without anchor or sail. He clung to his title, to his decrees, to the rituals of kingship, but inside he was a man unraveling, a tyrant stripped of certainty, a sinner staring into the abyss. And always the question lingered: what awaited him after death? Henry had broken with Rome, had crowned himself the earthly head of the church, yet he could not escape the teachings of his youth, the warnings of eternal damnation for the unrepentant. He had blood freely, wives, friends, subjects, and though he justified each act as necessary, the justifications seemed hollow in the stillness of night. Did he see himself cast into fire? Did he fear the judgment of saints and martyrs? Did he imagine a throne of gold dissolving into a pit of darkness? Those who stood vigil at his bedside saw the torment written upon his face. In moments of silence, his eyes darted as though following unseen figures. In moments of fury, his voice cracked with desperation, as though he could banish ghosts by shouting them down. His mind, once a fortress of ambition, was now a prison, its walls closing in with every passing hour. The torment grew worse as his body weakened. Fever gripped him, blurring the line between reality and vision. He mistook attendants for traitors, priests for demons, shadows for assassins. He swung between lucidity and delirium, leaving his council uncertain whether the king they served was truly alive or already half consumed by madness. His paranoia became policy. His nightmares became orders. England itself seemed to mirror his decay, trembling at every decree, uncertain of what tomorrow might bring. This was the true torture. Not only that his flesh rotted, but that his soul withered alongside it. Henry VIII, once master of nations, had become a captive of fear, a tyrant haunted by the faces of those he had destroyed. His death had not yet come, but already his spirit writhed in torment. His chamber was no longer the seat of a king, but the cell of a condemned man, awaiting a sentence only God could pronounce. And as winter pressed down upon England in 1547, the king's mind unraveled further. He clung to life not with hope, but with terror of what lay beyond. The crown upon his head was no longer a symbol of divine right, but a chain binding him to the world he feared to leave. In his silence, in his screams, in his endless suspicion, Henry VIII revealed the truth no monarch could ever admit: that power can not silence guilt, that wealth cannot buy peace, and that even a king may die more haunted than any beggar. The courtiers who witnessed his decline rarely spoke of it openly, but in their eyes lingered the horror of what they had seen. They had watched majesty decay. They had heard the cries of a man who feared his own soul. They had smelled the corruption of a king both in body and in spirit. And they knew, as all England knew, that the end was near. By the first weeks of 1547, Henry's torment had reached its darkest hour. The sickness that had gnawed at him for years now consumed him openly, leaving no part of his body untouched, no corner of his soul unscathed. The great halls of Whitehall, once alive with banquets and pageantry, echoed now with groans, with the rustle of fevered sheets, with the muffled prayers of priests who dared not raise their voices too loud. For all England knew, the king was dying. The question was not whether, but when. The king's bedchamber became a place of both horror and silence. Curtains were drawn tight against the January cold, yet the air inside was heavy, stagnant, thick with the odor of decay. The fire burned low, its smoke mingling with the stench of rotting flesh. Attendants tiptoed through the gloom, their faces pale, their steps hushed. Every movement seemed to carry the weight of ritual, as if they were already serving not a living monarch, but a corpse whose body had not yet given up its breath. Henry himself lay swollen and immobile, his frame vast beneath the covers. The ulcers on his legs had widened to grotesque caverns, seeping pus that stained the sheets despite constant changes. Fever burned through him, turning his skin blotched and red, his lips cracked and dry. He gasped for air, each breath rattling as though drawn through water. At times he coughed, and the sound was wet, filled with phlegm. Drops of blood stained the linens where he spat into cloths. No longer did he roar with rage as before. His voice had grown hoarse, his words slurred by weakness, his commands broken by wheezing. Yet even in that state, his attendants bowed, for to serve him was still to serve the King of England. But no crown could shield him from the terror of death. As the fever deepened, his visions grew stronger. He muttered to shadows, cursed unseen enemies, begged for mercy from figures only he could perceive. One moment he called out for Jane Seymour, as if reaching for the win, who had given him his only son. Another moment he screamed at Anne Boleyn, swearing that her death was just, though his voice cracked with doubt. At times he whispered for God's forgiveness, but the words stumbled as though caught in his throat. The mighty head of the Church of England trembled like a sinner awaiting judgment. Priests were summoned, though not openly. For Henry had forbidden talk of his death, forbidding even the whisper of it as treason. To acknowledge his mortality was to risk the wrath of a dying tyrant. Yet the council knew time was short. Secretly, they urged him to make peace with God, to confess, to seek absolution. But Henry, proud to the last, refused to admit defeat. He was no ordinary man, he insisted, but God's chosen king, beyond the reach of ordinary confession. Still the priests lingered, murmuring prayers in the shadows, offering what comfort they dared to a soul too burdened to receive it. Outside the chamber, the succession was already being prepared. Courtiers whispered of young Edward, his fragile health, his youth, his untested strength. Others spoke of Mary and Elizabeth, daughters divided by faith, destined to clash. The air of Whitehall was thick, not only with the odor of decay, but with the tension of uncertainty. The death of Henry VIII would not merely end a life, it would open a struggle for the future of England. Yet none dared speak of it within earshot of the king. To the very end, all must pretend that majesty endured, even as his body betrayed him hour by hour. In those final days, Henry's agony grew unbearable. The ulcers on his legs burst, spilling foul fluids that stained the chamber with their odor. His belly swelled, distended with disease. He could not rise from bed, could scarcely be moved, could not even turn without attendants straining at his vast frame. His body had become a prison of pain, each breath a labor, each heartbeat a torment. The great athlete who had once ridden horses into battle, who had danced until dawn, who had broken nations with his will, was reduced to a wheezing carcass waiting for release. And yet he clung to life. Those who watched marveled at his stubbornness. Each night they believed he would not survive until morning. And yet he lingered. Each dawn they thought he would not last until dusk. And yet he endured. It was as though he feared death more than pain, as though the horrors of the grave were greater than the tortures of his body. Perhaps he feared the judgment that awaited him. Perhaps he simply could not imagine a world without himself upon the throne. On the night of January 27th, his fever worsened. His attendants hovered close, listening to the ragged rasp of his breathing. His lips moved in mutters too faint to understand. Some swore he called for God, others that he cursed his name. His body shook with spasms, his sheets soaked with sweat and blood. A priest bent close to whisper prayers, but Henry turned his head away, eyes wild as though he saw something far more terrible than any comfort offered. His hand, swollen and trembling, reached out into empty air, grasping for something unseen. Perhaps it was the hand of a ghost. Perhaps it was the hand of judgment. When morning came, he was still alive, but only just. His council, gathered in secret, prepared for the inevitable. Edward Seymour, his brother-in-law, tightened his grip on power. Messengers rode to secure the succession. Yet within the king's chamber, the world had narrowed to a bed, a body, a struggle for breath. On January 28th, the end at last arrived. His breathing grew shallower, each gasp more labored than the last. The ulcers on his legs had bled through their bandages, soaking the sheets in foul fluid. His skin was pale, mottled, stretched tight across his swollen frame. His eyes, once fierce and commanding, were glazed, half open, staring not at the world around him, but at something far beyond. Those who watched swore he seemed to follow invisible figures with his gaze, as though the phantoms that had haunted his nights had come at last to claim him. The chamber was silent except for his gasps. Priests prayed softly. Courtiers bowed their heads. Servants clutched handkerchiefs to their faces to block the stench. The king, the man who had once defied Rome, who had broken queens and raised empires, now lay helpless, stripped of power, awaiting the same fate as the lowest of his subjects. No axe, no enemy, no battle had brought him down. It was his own body, his own sins, his own mortality that conquered him in the end. And then, with a final shudder, the breath ceased. The chamber fell still. The great bulk of Henry VIII sank into silence, the weight of his presence replaced by the weight of death itself. A king had died, but not with glory, not with triumph, not with the hymns of heaven. He had died in rot and fear, in the grip of a body that had betrayed him, in the torment of a soul that could find no peace. Those present did not rejoice. They did not weep. They stood in silence, as though unsure whether to mourn the man or to fear the ghost he had become. For though his body lay still, his reign lingered in the scars he had left upon England, scars that would shape the kingdom for generations. And so ended Henry VIII, not with majesty but with horror. His last agony was not swift but drawn out, not noble but grotesque, not dignified but monstrous. His life had been a storm, and his death was the wreckage left in its wake. The silence that followed Henry's last breath was heavier than any roar of battle. For a moment, all who stood in the chamber felt as though the world itself had stopped. The man whose will had bent kingdoms, whose wrath had toppled queens, whose appetites had devoured lives and fortunes alike, now lay still upon the bed. His massive frame, once animated by insatiable hunger for power and pleasure, was nothing more than dead flesh. The ulcered legs that had poisoned the air now sagged lifeless. The eyes that had burned with suspicion stared blankly into the void. And yet, though his body was gone, the shadow he cast remained. No herald announced his passing at once. It was dangerous to declare the king dead until the machinery of succession was in place. His council, grim and tight-lipped, moved swiftly to secure power for his young son Edward. They sealed the chamber, forbade servants to speak, and spread whispers of strength and continuity, even as the kingdom stood on the brink of uncertainty. But nothing could erase the reality that England's most formidable monarch had perished not in triumph, but in torment. In the streets beyond the palace walls, word spread slowly, carried by rumor before proclamation. Some mourned, many did not. For the people remembered not only the splendor of Henry's reign, but the blood it had spilled. They remembered the taxes, the executions, the monasteries torn apart, the burnings at the stake. Some whispered that his death was justice, that God himself had struck him down with rot and agony. Others, more cautious, wondered if his spirit would linger, haunting the land as it had haunted his own chamber. For a man such as Henry, could death truly end his reign? Or had his tyranny carved itself so deeply into England that it would outlive him? His funeral, when it came, was no ordinary passing of a king. The coffin was so large, it took dozens to move it. Draped in velvet, carried through streets, it was both a spectacle and a warning. Behind the procession walked nobles and priests, some solemn, others secretly relieved. They marched in silence, yet within their hearts the echoes of his deeds resounded. For Henry had left behind not peace, but division. His son Edward, though legitimate, was but a boy, frail in health. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, declared bastards by their father at different points, hovered in the shadows of succession, their futures uncertain. England itself stood fractured, torn between faiths, trembling between the old church and the new. The body of Henry VIII, swollen even in death, began its own grotesque journey. Chroniclers tell of the coffin seeping fluids during transport, a grim echo of the rot that had consumed him. Some whispered of a dog licking at the spillage, a dark omen that the king's sins had followed him even into death. Whether true or not, the tale spread, for it captured what all felt, that Henry's end was not noble but cursed, that his reign had closed not in majesty but in horror, and yet his legacy endured. He had torn England from the Pope's grasp, forging a national church whose shadow would shape centuries. He had produced heirs who would carry the Tudor name into legend. Edward, the boy king, Mary, the Catholic zealot, Elizabeth, the virgin queen. He had amassed power, centralized monarchy, and left behind a kingdom both stronger and more fragile than he had found it. For though he had carved his name into history, he had done so with blood and fire, leaving wounds that time would struggle to heal. In truth, Henry's greatest monument was not his tomb, but his children. Through them, the echoes of his choices would reverberate. Edward would enforce the Protestant faith, only to die young. Mary would drag England back toward Rome, lighting the fires of persecution, earning the name Bloody Mary. Elizabeth would rise from the chaos to forge a golden age, her reign haunted always by the shadow of her father's deeds. Thus, Henry's ghost walked by, sighed them all, shaping their crowns, whispering in their councils, binding their fates to his own. But beyond politics, beyond dynasties, Henry's legacy was darker still. He had shown the world the terrible cost of a monarch unchecked, a ruler who placed his will above law, above faith, above humanity itself. He had turned wives into sacrifices, faith into a weapon, power into an idol. He had lived as though immortal, and yet he had died as every man dies, in pain, in fear, in decay. His final lesson was one no subject could miss, that no crown protects against death, and no throne can shield a man from judgment. In later years, stories of his death spread like wildfire. They spoke of his festering body, of the smell that drove servants to gag, of the nightmares that tormented him, of the priests who feared to grant him absolution. Some tales grew darker still, claiming that in his final moments he cried out not for God but for Anne Boleyn, or that he cursed the heavens with his last breath. Whether truth or legend, the stories endured, for they reflected what all believed, that Henry VIII had not died peacefully, but horribly, his end as violent and grotesque as his life had been. Even now, centuries later, the image remains vivid. The bloated king in his silken bed, gasping for air, haunted by the faces of the dead. The ulcers bursting, the chamber stinking, the courtiers watching in fear. The hand that had signed death warrants trembling at the edge of the abyss. The crown gleaming uselessly on a head already condemned. It is not the picture of triumph, but of terror. A warning carved into history with the same finality as the axe that once fell upon his wives. Henry VIII was buried with pomp, as all kings are, but no splendor could erase the truth. Beneath the gilded coffin lay a body consumed by corruption, a man who had feared death and found no escape from it. The bells rang, the hymns rose, but the silence of the grave swallowed them all. And in that silence, England turned the page, though the shadow of its monstrous king lingered long after the earth closed over him. This was his bitter legacy, a reign of glory and horror, of triumph and torment, ending not in the hymns of angels, but in the groans of a dying tyrant. His life had reshaped a kingdom, but his death had revealed the frailty of all power. He had lived as a lion and died as carrion, and history, relentless as the grave, remembered both. And so the tale of Henry VIII ends, not as a story of majesty, but as a dark parable whispered through time. Power cannot conquer death. Pride cannot silence guilt. Flesh, no matter how gilded, will rot. And even a king, even the greatest of kings, must one day lie silent, his crown resting uselessly above the bones that once carried his will. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.